Mankind must not go back to hiding in fear. No one else will protect us, and we must stand up for ourselves. While the rest of mankind dwells in the light, we must stand in the darkness to fight it, contain it, and shield it from the eyes of the public, so that others may live in a sane and normal world. We secure, we contain, we protect. That was a quote from the administrator of the SCP Foundation. What is the SCP Foundation? It is a secret organization that is empowered by every major national government on the planet. It's impossible to say for sure when the Foundation in its current form came to be, but some reports suggest as far back as 1891. They are allowed and expected to work without boundaries or limits, to do whatever is necessary to ensure the continued survival and well-being of our world. They don't fight crime or terrorism or prevent biochemical warfare. Things like that are generally human will acting against the will of others, which, regardless of your moral compass, is a normal thing for humans to do. The SCP Foundation acts in opposition to things that are not what people would consider to be normal. There are things, places, events, and entities that exist in our world, but don't quite follow the same rules as us. There are monsters, demons, mutants, old gods, magic items, unexplainable phenomena, and a vast host of other things that can be summed up as anomalies. An anomaly is defined as something that deviates from what is standard, normal, or expected. While an anomaly isn't necessarily dangerous and is sometimes a good thing, the fact remains that it isn't normal. It isn't normal for a single pill to be able to cure any and every illness, mutation, or injury a person could sustain and return them to perfect health. It isn't normal for a sentient blob creature with the consistency of peanut butter to exist at all, much less make people feel happy just by physically touching it. It isn't normal for a person to be able to reach their hand into a photograph of a place and physically interact with the things in the actual place that was photographed. It isn't normal for a creature that does not require food, oxygen, or any other form of sustenance to exist at all, much less for it to viciously murder anyone who sees its face, even in photographs, regardless of what stands between them and the victim. We humans are, generally speaking, very dependent on what we understand to be the rules for our mental well-being. We know what's possible and what's not, and that confidence keeps us sane as we stand on a rapidly spinning rock whirling around a colossal ball of flaming gas in an unimaginably huge and empty darkness. When we encounter something that doesn't follow those rules, something we don't know how to explain, it can change everything. It can change our perception of the people around us, the world we live in, our place in it. It can make us lie awake at night in confusion and fear, make us paranoid and angry that we can't find the answers. It can make us wonder what else in this vast universe we don't know, and start to question our own sanity. In order for human society to live and thrive, normalcy is necessary. We'll only feel comfortable when we believe the rules are absolute, and that any weird thing we encounter has a perfectly reasonable explanation, even if that explanation is simply that we don't quite know what happened, but it must be a normal thing we didn't fully understand, and then we try not to think about it anymore. That is what the SCP Foundation exists for. The Foundation is an absolute line of defense, working to contain every dark, frightening, and abnormal thing that could break that sense of normalcy and safety and keep it hidden from us. You may be wondering, but Lorekeeper, what about those good things you mentioned, like the pill that could cure any disease? Shouldn't we want to have that in our world? Yes, absolutely, and that brings us to the next prerogative of the SCP Foundation. They don't just contain and hide the anomalies, they study them intensely. Many anomalies really do have a reasonable explanation that we simply didn't understand when we as a species first encountered them. If we can learn what the anomaly is, how and why it does what it does, we may come to a greater level of understanding that would make the anomaly no longer anomalous or dangerous to us. Additionally, we may obtain knowledge that would be a massive benefit to humanity. If we could learn where these incredible pills came from and create more of them ourselves, the potential exists to free humanity from every disease and injury imaginable. But should the general public learn about this pill, the potential also exists that it could be abused, kept for only the wealthiest and most privileged, or adapted to more sinister purposes. There is the possibility that small conflicts or even wars could occur over opposing interests or nations that want the limited supply of pills. The possibility also exists that the pill has side effects which are not readily apparent, and if it was used haphazardly, it could become a disaster that spirals out of control, such as creating a zombie apocalypse. And of course, the potential exists that all of the pills would be used up before we figure out how to make more. There are only about 50 of these pills left in the bottle in which they were discovered, and the Foundation is no closer to finding out how to create more or how they work. So, they continue to research, while also preventing them from being discovered and misused. What is an SCP? Well, the acronym SCP can mean Secure, Contain, Protect, the motto of the SCP Foundation. It can mean Special Containment Procedures, which is the method used to keep an anomaly contained and secured. However, when we say an SCP, what we refer to is a specific anomaly that has been identified by the Foundation. An SCP can be a person, place, object, non-human entity, event, anything that is anomalous or abnormal. Even some knowledge is considered an SCP because just knowing it can cause anomalous effects. At the time of this video, there are nearly 6,000 SCP files in the Foundation's database, some of which contain information on multiple subjects referenced within the same file, not to mention addendums, stories, and field reports. Additionally, given the Foundation's obvious need to operate under the strictest secrecy possible, there are even files and pieces of information that are untrue and intentionally placed to mislead those looking for information that they shouldn't have. Many SCPs are contained within one of the Foundation's myriad secure sites somewhere in the world. Others that cannot be moved, such as an island with anomalous effects on anyone who walks on it, are contained via preventing normal people from approaching it with walls, guards, fictitious information placed on maps and satellite scans of an area, whatever is needed to keep people away and prevent anything inside the quarantined area from escaping. How are SCPs classified? Every SCP is given a class that denotes the difficulty, cost, and complexity of keeping it contained. This is something that will sometimes confuse newer researchers because they will assume that an SCP object's class denotes how dangerous it is to humans. There are 3 primary classes: Safe, Euclid, and Keter. Again, I must stress that these classes refer to the containment procedures of an object, not the danger of an object itself. So do not assume that an object classified as safe is not dangerous. And do not assume that an object classified as Keter is incredibly dangerous, though, to be fair, most are. Classifying an SCP can be complicated, as several factors go into determining what class an SCP is, but the standard often used is what's called the locked box test. If you were to take an SCP in question, lock it in a box and walk away, what would happen? If the object would stay in the box without consequence, it's probably safe. If you're not quite sure whether it would escape the box or not, or if leaving it alone would result in eventual death of the SCP via suffocation or starvation, it's probably Euclid. If you're fairly certain the SCP will escape the box, then it's probably Keter. Nearly all sentient SCPs are at least Euclid class, since it's possible they are smart enough to figure out a way of escape from simple containment eventually, or because they need sustenance to stay alive. Since destroying an SCP is an absolute last resort, an SCP dying of starvation while in containment is an unfavorable outcome. The 4th class is Thaumiel. Many SCP Foundation personnel do not even know this class exists. Thaumiel class objects are anomalous objects the Foundation uses to contain or neutralize other objects. To relate this to the locked box test, if the SCP is the box you're putting something in, then it's probably a Thaumiel. Next is Neutralized. This class is for those SCPs that are no longer anomalous due to being destroyed or disabled. The object may still exist, but its anomalous properties are gone. Explained class objects are those that are completely and fully understood and can now be explained by mainstream science. This class is also used for anomalies that were debunked or were labeled anomalous by mistake. You may also see SCP files with the object class Decommissioned. In short, you can consider these files to be bad information, and they should be disregarded. If an SCP operative were to create a file for a new SCP which was added to the database, and it was later discovered that this file should never have been created and the SCP in question does not exist, the file would be removed and labeled as decommissioned. Lastly, there are what are called esoteric or narrative classes. These are unique classes, generally only used once, and tend to fit the narrative of the specific SCP the file is referring to. One example is the Apollyon class, which was used for the file When Day Breaks. This SCP is an anomalous event, and the Apollyon class was used to describe it as being impossible to contain, prevent, or reverse the effects of once it occurred. You won't see these very often, since nearly all SCPs fit into one of the already established classes. Naturally, no single government can command or control the entire SCP Foundation, given what it needs to do. The Foundation has the blessing of every major government, but does not operate under their control. So, who does control the Foundation? Well, that would be O5 Command and the Administrator. O5 Command, or the O5 Council, consists of 13 individuals known only as O5-1 through O5-13. Virtually no one knows their real names, backstories, or origins. Many in the Foundation believe that they are anomalous beings themselves, but no one is certain of anything. Given that they are the very heart of the Foundation, O5 Command is never to come into direct contact with any SCP in order to prevent any anomalous effects from afflicting them and endangering the Foundation. They have absolute authority and power over the entirety of the Foundation, and any command coming from O5 is immediately obeyed without question, though admittedly, they don't often intervene in the containment and research of SCPs. The Administrator, who formerly represented the Foundation in meetings with major national governments, is even more mysterious. Are they a power higher than the O5 Council? Or do they perform tasks so heavily classified that no one but the Council can know? Is it a title given to a chosen individual for a time? Or is it somehow the same person who has existed since the Foundation's creation? Only the O5 Council knows for sure, and officially, they're not telling. Unofficially, well, that's a story for another time. Each SCP Foundation site is managed by a site director who reports directly to the O5 Council, and who is responsible for maintaining the continued safe operation of their site and all the anomalies contained within. The Foundation also employs field agents, which are undercover operatives trained to identify anomalies in everyday life. They are often in law enforcement, emergency services, or regulatory organizations, but your nosy next-door neighbor who never accepts your invitations to a backyard cookout, but who always seems to be on top of the local gossip, could be an SCP field agent. Additionally, the Foundation employs mobile task forces, countless researchers and scientific experts, highly trained security officers, medical experts, their own private heavily armed military, and what are called D-Class personnel for the purpose of hazardous testing and research. A D-Class personnel is typically a prisoner on death row, usually for committing violent crimes, that the Foundation has been allowed to take and use as a guinea pig. Many D-Class are told that as long as they comply completely with the Foundation's instructions and test protocols, they will receive a full pardon and be released. D-Class personnel all undergo regular psychiatric evaluation to ensure that they have the mental capacity to perform the tasks expected of them, and when their service is complete, they will either be administered a drug that will erase their recent memories, or they will be killed. In closing, I want to leave you with this. We all know that there are things out there in the world that cannot be explained. Many of us will mock those who have a fear of the dark, refuse to say certain words, or often look over their shoulder without explaining why. Many of us will laugh at the superstitious customs of those around us, confident in our knowledge that we understand the world around us and can handle any threat that comes our way. We shrug off the scary stories we hear or read as pranks or insanity and go back to living our lives. Ensuring that society can continue to function this way is the core purpose of the SCP Foundation. They strive to keep the world the same shape as you expect it to be, and make sure you don't have to worry about the dangers written outside of the rulebook. Some of what the Foundation does may seem cruel or even evil. Some of it may very well be. But know that if not for the Foundation, human society would likely devolve back into huddling around fires in small caves, fearful of the things outside that we couldn't understand, and hoping with all our hearts that we weren't found. You're happier not knowing what could happen should the Foundation's walls come crashing down, and honestly, happier not knowing what's contained inside them. Those of us who know don't look down on those of you who don't want to know, and there's no shame in enjoying the peace those in the shadows fight to give you. But if, like me, you're willing to sacrifice some of that security and peace to obtain deeper knowledge and understanding about what's possible in this world that we live in, then by all means, come back around and I'll share with you what I've learned. At least until the Foundation decides I've said to.